Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, what is horror? So I say at the start of every video, crime, pulp, horror, three different genres which are defined in very different ways. I always find it interesting thinking about the different genres of fiction and how they kind of morph over time, how they change over time, and how we define and understand them. So if you take those three, for example, so crime fiction, a fairly easy one to define. Fiction that involves crime. So it could be, like golden age mystery fiction. It could be police procedurals. It could be, domestic suspense type fiction, or it could be, kind of gangster style fiction. So quite different types of crime fiction, but all clearly crime fiction. Pulp is interesting as well because pulp is not really a genre, it's more a mode of publication. So, the pulp magazines back in the day published a wide variety of different styles of fiction. They published, horror fiction, fantasy, crime, like sports fiction, boxing stories and things like that were really popular in the pulps. So it's more the way the stories are published than a genre in the classical sense of the word. And when you think about other genres, so I'll come to horror in a minute, when you think about other genres, again, like crime fiction, they tend to be quite easy to define. So science fiction, it involves science, it involves, thinking about the future often, or thinking about the way science can impact our lives, but in a fictional sense. Fantasy fiction involves fantastical things, can be set in other worlds that are fantastical, but it can also be, stories that involve fantasy, weird things going on in our own world. Romance fiction, centres around a romance, clearly. The other one that's interesting, and I talked about this recently on the channel, is thriller fiction. So thriller fiction can cover quite a wide range of different things. So nowadays we tend to use it to describe that kind of domestic suspense style fiction, which is really popular at the moment. Personally, when I think about thriller fiction, I think about espionage fiction, action adventure style fiction, that kind of thing. So thriller fiction is really a type of fiction that's defined by how it makes you feel, rather than a particular style of writing or kind of setting or things like that. So it's a bit different from the other ones in that sense. And I really enjoy thriller fiction. I enjoy that sense of being exhilarated, but I think it's that defines, the term thriller, rather than anything else. So now we come to horror fiction, and horror fiction is, I think, probably the most interesting of all of them, because in its purest sense, I think you could define horror fiction as something that is intended to horrify. So just like thriller fiction is intended to thrill the reader, to make them, want to keep on reading, to find out what's going to happen, the kind of fiction that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Horror fiction should be something that horrifies or terrifies you, something that, freaks you out, that scares you, that sends chills down your spine, or maybe that evokes a more kind of physical, like gut sense of horror, something that is, appalling. So when you think about, different styles of horror fiction, supernatural fiction tends to be, kind of spooky or scary. Extreme horror fiction tends to be, kind of sometimes like nauseatingly violent. But those are two different types and two different ways in which the reader can be horrified. Personally, I quite enjoy both of them, but they are quite different from each other. The thing that I think that is interesting about horror fiction, though, is that over time it's become much broader than that. So originally, horror fiction, evoked those two things. It either scared you or, horrified you in some way. So you think about kind of early horror fiction, things like Dracula by Bram Stoker, some of the like Victorian ghost stories, the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Those were stories that would, scare or horrify the reader in some way. But they also are stories that have particular elements to them, typically elements of the supernatural. And I think that is another way that nowadays we define horror fiction. We define horror fiction as being fiction that involves elements of the supernatural. And that can end up being fiction which actually isn't scary or isn't horrifying. And indeed, a lot of fiction nowadays is really thriller fiction, but it's thriller fiction with supernatural elements. So this video was actually inspired by a comment from a viewer with a fantastic name of Super Strange Shadow, who commented on my What is a Thriller video, saying, that he felt that a lot of horror fiction nowadays was actually thriller fiction. And I think that's definitely true. When you think of someone like Riley Sager, whose works are, not all of his works are described as horror, but some of them are certainly marketed as horror. They do feel more like thrillers than they do horrors. They are not necessarily horrifying books in the classic sense of the word that I've described. So I think nowadays horror has kind of morphed into two different things. There is definitely still horror out there that is designed to horrify or terrify the reader. But there are also books which are books that kind of play in the horror genre, that use kind of tropes and supernatural elements and things like that are common in horror fiction, but do it for a different effect, do it for more of a kind of suspense or thriller style effect. There's another type of fiction that's getting really marketed as horror nowadays as well, and that, I guess, brings me a bit of joy. So this is fiction which is horrifying, certainly, often contains scenes of violence and things like that you could describe as horrifying, but doesn't necessarily have those supernatural elements, and which is probably more something that you might describe as literary fiction. So I'm thinking about books here like The Lamb by Lucy Rose or The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim, both of which I've read recently. So these are books that a few years ago I think probably would have been marketed as literary fiction, but now, currently are being marketed as horror as well. And that for me says that horror is having a bit of a moment at the moment. It's getting more popular and people are paying more attention to it. And when that happens with a genre, publishers tend to broaden their definition of that genre to try and include other things, because from a marketing perspective it makes sense. So I definitely think that's happened with the two books I mentioned. Horror is gaining a bit more respect at the moment, both in terms of fiction and cinema as well. You'd think of films like Sinners that came out recently, which are getting really a lot of critical praise. When that happens, publishers and movie studios and things like that pay a bit more attention, and that means hopefully we will get even more horror fiction in the years ahead. So anyway, those are my thoughts on what is horror. Do let me know in the comments what you think. Do you agree that there are kind of two different styles of horror, one which uses horror tropes but isn't necessarily horrifying, and the other which is horrifying but doesn't necessarily always include horror tropes? Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.